Hi, we move into Genesis 30 today as we continue the scene, as you can see on the right side of the screen, at the center of the center section of the whole Jacob story, with Leah and Rachel and the two other wives, Bilhah and Zilpah, producing children. For Jacob, for themselves, for Yahweh, for Elohim, we'll have to see. So as I'm noting here on the right side of the screen, again, we're in our center section, and one of the things I didn't note last time, because we only had Leah, now we have Leah and Rachel, and we'll have more of that, as we'll see in the second part of this next time around the mandrakes, as a conclusion of this unit here, that their rivalry here parallels in many ways that of Jacob and Esau that we saw up here, which reaches its reconciliation on the other side of it here. And I'd like to suggest that both situations, the boys' alienation between each other over the birthright and the blessing, and the sisters over having children, are both functions of patriarchy, one on the men and one on the women, and the customs of the time. As I noted when we were looking through these passages here of birthright and blessing, neither of those has any effect whatsoever on the lives of the two brothers other than to alienate them from each other and from their parents. The paternal blessing has no meaning whatsoever. It's simply words. It has no power. The only meaning it has is that Isaac feels like he can't offer words like that in God's name to both his sons just because of custom. And so he alienates himself from his sons and they from each other for no good reason whatsoever, and nothing comes of it. And the birthright, as we'll see on the other side, Jacob even tries to give back, as we'll see. So neither of those have any meaning other than alienation. And similarly here, we saw last time that Leah had 3 children that she named as ways of trying to get her husband Jacob, her man Jacob, to want her and to be with her. And then finally she offers one for in praise and gratitude to Yahweh. But now we're going to see them fighting with each other a little bit over this, and we'll highlight the alienation of the 2 sisters from each other is parallel to the alienation of the 2 brothers from each other. It also has to do, as we've been noting, with the levels that we're reading this here in the post-exilic context of what it means for those in exile to be dealing with a Mesopotamian cultural context, which has a whole different set of presuppositions than what the exiles would have had from before they left, but especially with Genesis and other exilic texts offering other options as we go, and we'll look at that. In fact, why don't I just look at that now, as we did last time briefly. I won't go over this in detail because I looked at it last time. But the 2 questions of what makes us the people of Yahweh Elohim, and then we see these varieties of options that were available to the exilic and post-exilic audience, and similarly, how is our society organized under Yahweh's rule, and then we see this version, again, competing with other versions from exile. So this story is one of a number of texts that emerge from exile to answer these questions, as we've been seeing. So in terms of the structure of the immediate section, we've been looking at this larger chiasm, and we've been looking at how the women's section here forms its own chiasm, and right now we're in these B and C parts, and I've organized the key words chart that we'll look at around this section, as we'll see in just a moment. Other things that we won't look at in detail now, but are relevant for this section, are how these stories parallel or yet are different to the wife-sister stories we saw in Genesis 12, 20, and 26, as well as how this entire section can be read as an allegory of the monarchy in exile. And in today's passage, we see how Rachel's demanding sons in our first verse is parallel to Hannah praying for sons at the very beginning of Samuel, which 1 Samuel 1, as we looked at in that series, as Polza notes, is already itself an allegory of the monarchy. And so putting up our key words here, you note that these are the chiastic units as in indentions show here. So we're looking at this section and this section here. And something I didn't note last time, but one of the feminist scholars that I was reading highlighted this, and we'll look at it when we look at our individual notes, is how 6 of the 11 sons that are named, 6 of the 12 children altogether, including Dinah, are described by the narrator as bearing Jacob a son. So we'll see in today's unit here, for the first time, bore Jacob a son, then bore Jacob a second son, and then Leah via Zilpah is twice described as bore Jacob a son, and then we'll see it also here, bore Jacob a son, a 5th and a 6th. But the others are not described as bore sons of Jacob. Does that mean they're less important? Does that mean they're not Jacob's? That's not clear. But clearly for the surrogates here, who are described as wives, as women, Isha, as we'll see, these are all attributed to being Jacob's sons. So certainly the point for these 4 here is that although they were given, they were children via Zilpah and Bilhah, they are Jacob's sons. But of course they're Jacob's sons because he's the sperm donor, so there's no question if he's the biological father. The question is, are they Zilpah and Bilhah's sons? But that's never described as that at all. So we'll see more of that as we go. So let's enter into our story here. And with great sadness and irony, the story begins with the only conversation we've seen between Rachel and Jacob and the only time she's spoken so far. I was noting in chapter 29 that when Jacob sees her and loves her and wants her and engages in his testosterone-driven ability to lift the stone off the well, it's all on Jacob's side, and we know nothing about what Rachel thought or felt, and we've known nothing about what she's thought or felt all the years that have gone by, the 7 that he was serving her father for Leah, and the 7 he served her father for her, and plenty of those have passed. We're not sure if the last 7 have passed, but there's a clue to the chronology we'll see here. But after at least 14 years, this is the first time we see them exchange words, and it's not pretty. So when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, and as my note below says, the narrative withholds for the conclusion of the multi-year period the description of Rachel's reaction. We can now look back and imagine how this envy has been building day by day, child by child. So plainly what's implied is they've been having sex, but she's not been able to get pregnant, unlike her sister Leah. So she envied her sister, echoing the Philistines envying Isaac back in 26:14 and anticipating Joseph's brothers envying him in chapter 37, and described here as her sister. Here and only in verse 8 are references in Genesis to a sister of a sister. Previous uses involve the wife-sister stories, and that's one of the many elements that I was noting from Spolstra that highlights the parallels and differences between Jacob's encounters with these 2 women and the wife-sister stories we saw earlier. And so she says to Jacob, the first word she speaks, "Give me children or I shall die." The phrase "forgive me" here is not the same phrase we see "forgive Natan," the normal word for giving here. As we see, it's hava. Previously is "come now" in the Tower of Babel story 3 times there, but it can also mean "give me" here. And as my note further below says from Crane in a recent article, in saying that he fixed the problem, she thereby suggests that he is the problem itself. But plainly, he's not the problem, at least in terms of being fertile, because we've already seen he's bore Leah 4 children. Or he's provided for Leah to bear 4 children for him. Notice she says it in plural here, sons, as Hannah's desire, really making clear the parallel there. Not just one, but more. And we'll see when she finally has Joseph, she names Joseph, the word meaning added, whether that's about adding to him or that he's been added to her, that's her only child, or she wants one more. And then she concludes this, "or I shall die." Notice the similarity between what Rebecca had while she was pregnant, that if it's like this, that she would die, although she was pregnant with twins at the time. As the note below has from Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, the phrase is literally, "and if not, I die." And one midrash reads that in light of the 2 names for women, Hava and Isha. Hava meaning Eve, or the mother of the living, and Isha for woman, the procreative and the intellectual spiritual partner to man. And she says, quote, "A woman who cannot bear children still has what the commentator calls her greatest purpose in life, her moral and spiritual role, equivalent to a man's." And that from the Midrash, long before feminist commentary wanted to comment on the effect of women being enslaved by patriarchy to be limited to parenthood, and a question that's still at issue as I'm making this video in the 21st century. The rabbis were on top of that long ago, that women had a spiritual life in addition to the life as mothers. Her demand that she be given children or die ironically foreshadows that she will die by childbirth with Benjamin in chapter 35, way after this scene. And so we hear Jacob's response here. Jacob became very angry. Not just angry, but very angry. His only emotional response since he loved her, and since we heard that the 7 years of service were just like one day. And it's a strong phrase, "vayaher off meaning nostrils." So as Will Gaffney suggests, the expression denotes a snorting bull. And plainly it sees his nostrils are flaring in anger. It recalls Cain's anger at God, Abraham's anticipation of God's anger over him, arguing about the fate of Sodom, Jacob's at Laban later in the story, the sons of Jacob at the rape of their sister Dinah, and Potiphar's at Joseph for allegedly being inappropriately with his wife, with Potiphar's wife. So very strong situations, and yet Jacob's response to Rachel, the first thing he's going to say to her out loud is this. So, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Notice he attributes it to God, and we've not noted throughout this that God is an active character at all, other than remembering or noting that Leah was unloved and opening her womb, but simply in the background at the frame of the story. So it's up to the characters to decide, is God responsible for fertility here? But there's a general and a specific question there. Is God responsible for fertility in the broad sense that God is a creator? Sure. But is God responsible for specific acts of fertility, as we heard the narrator tell us, that God is doing things to be involved directly in the process? And that's not clear to the characters. They can't attribute every pregnancy to God's special intervention. But when do you think it's God, and when do you think it's just what we would call biology? But his question is, am I in the place of God here? In the place here, hetakat here, 31 times in Genesis, but it implies under, as in the first chapters of Genesis. We can see that just briefly here. So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome. So in that sense, we could read this as, am I under God, or am I is God above me in that sense? And as my note below here has from Robert Alter, virtually an explicit reference by one of the characters to the traditional requirements of an Annunciation type scene of being in the place of God. Notice it's Elohim 7 times in the chapter, where the chapter is framed by Yahweh, again underscoring the fact that there's no need to separate this into sources, since the story is so tightly woven into an integrated literary unit as it is. So Jacob attributes to God withholding from you the fruit of the womb, that it's an active process from God to not let Rachel have children. Why that would be the case, we don't know. And what their relationship has been in the years since Jacob has actually been with her, we have no clue whatsoever. But certainly the anger is breaking forth here. The phrase "fruit of the womb" we lasso as fruit all the way back in 4:3 with Cain's offering, not the fruit of the womb, but the fruit of the land there. And so it's a common phrase later, but it's the first time we hear it here. And the word for womb here is not the same word we saw for opening the womb, framing the story here. It's baton here, and we can't pronounce it without the vowels, but we saw that in chapter 25 and here, and then only once later in 38. So an unusual use for the word there. So she offers a plan. In the midst of his rhetorical question, or is it a rhetorical question, she offers a plan. And I note that I corrected my key words here to put slave woman Bilhah here, because what's named as maid here is Amma, and yet when it's used back in chapter 21 to refer to Hagar, it's as slave woman. And so there's no reason to distinguish here. I noted the same thing from Will Gaffney, that the term that's translated as maid-servant, shipha, also refers, when it's referred to Hagar, as slave woman in a different way. So there's no reason. This just seems to me racism to translate them differently, simply because Hagar is an Egyptian, and we don't know Bilhah's ethnicity, but presumably they're Mesopotamians coming from the family of Laban, but we don't know that. So here she's offered as an Amma, as a slave woman. Go into her that she may bear upon my knees, and that I may too have children through her. And if you're not familiar with it, that phrase becomes really important for The Handmaid's Tale, the Margaret Atwood story of a fundamentalist takeover of the United States, when this story becomes key to it, and in a very dark situation. So the idea here is that Bilhah would be put in between the legs of Rachel, and so Jacob would be having sex with both of them at the same time, such that Bilhah becomes the surrogate. It's an awkward and not pretty scene at all, but that's the desperation that the text finds Rachel in here. And that I may too have children through her, or literally be built up, an offer building up, but in the Nephal here it can be read as have children. So we see something very important here. She gave him her shipha, here it's shipha again, as a woman, as an isha. And not as a shipha, not as a secondary woman, but as a woman. And so this is what's happening. And notice that she does that much as Leah will do, the same way that men take women in the story of Kings in 1 Samuel 8, that they will take your daughters and do what they want with them. And so here, within a patriarchal context, she feels it's appropriate to take this other woman and send her to Jacob involuntarily to have sex with her, much like Sarah did with Hagar. But there's no sense here that she's in that sense of a slave as when we read Hagar, as we had the sense there, and yet the language is the same. So Jacob went into her, which is to highlight that he had sex with her, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. And that's the first one of those that we see of bore Jacob a son. And so some translation issues here in the version of what Rachel says when she names the child. And as I note, as a number of feminist scholars note, I didn't note it in the last video, the very fact that the women are naming their sons and Jacob seems to have nothing to do with it is already an anti-patriarchal element of this. We saw that with Eve way back when she named Seth, and you can see that here, as a number of scholars have noted the parallel between that scene and these female namings here. But God has judged me is probably the wrong way to translate this. As Tammy Schneider suggested, has pled my cause, as another scholar notes, has vindicated me. So it's not a matter as expressed judgment, but has rendered judgment for me, and has heard my voice, Shema Kol, from back here in 423, and also a number of times, including with Hagar there. As Yair Zakovich suggests, her assumption that God has heeded her plea is premature. She will pay heavily for having tried to outmaneuver God, which is to say she will die in childbirth the next time. And given me a son. Notice she assumes the surrogacy rights despite giving Bilhah as an Isha, as a woman. And so she names him Dan. And as another scholar's note, out of a note here specifically on it, these are not what scholars refer to as theophoric names. So Daniel, which is El, has El in it, like Elohim, or names with Yah in them, like Rachel for that matter, like Yah in them, like Isaiah or Jeremiah, have Yahweh in them. But these are not theophoric names. So even though it's attributing it to God, and Elohim here, it could have been Danielle, but instead it's simply Dan. And so without any further ado, Rachel's now still referred to as a Shippa, even though she gave her as an Isha, conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And then we hear for the first time something that maybe we suspected, but we hadn't heard it explicitly. Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. So she named him Naphtali. And I'll scroll down so we can get the rest of our unit here. But had they been wrestling? In the first scene that we saw last time in 29:31-35, we simply saw Leah wrestling in her own heart with her relationship with Jacob, but no mention of Rachel there. But now we know that Rachel's been watching for all the years that Leah was having children, and they were beginning to grow up, and so she expresses this now, what was only implicit. And the phrase here, Naphtali Elohim Naphtali, translated as mighty wrestlings, but as Wenham suggests, could be divine wrestlings, because it is Elohim, which can be both an adjective of strength, but also obviously God. Neither form of the word for wrestling, though, the verb or the noun here, are elsewhere in Hebrew Scripture, as Westerman notes. The verb form is in the Nephal in two other places there. And as Bailey, a feminist scholar, notes, this is unexpected. Until this point, there is no hint in the narrative that either Leah or Rachel sees herself as being in a competition with her sister. Yair Zakovich translates this as a fateful contest I waged with my sister. So either way, we read that. So I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. And the phrase for prevailed here, yakal, is 22 times in Genesis, but it explicitly will have to do with Jacob wrestling with Esau and prevailing, quote-unquote Esau, whoever it is he's wrestling with. That's my note there. But you can reserve judgment until we get there, or after, for that matter, of who Jacob is wrestling with. But it certainly suggests a parallel, that as he will be wrestling, at least with the spirit of his brother, nocturnally or otherwise, she is metaphorically wrestling with her sister, again, as the function of patriarchy here. So when Leah saw that she'd ceased bearing, and that draws us here to the recognition that this follows here in verse 8, or in verse 9, directly from what followed here at the end of chapter 29, verse 35. Then she ceased bearing, and when Leah saw that she ceased bearing. So what we just looked at in 31-8 here is inserted in between to highlight that this is happening simultaneously, that what's following here is happening at the same time. So when she's given Bilhah over, Leah also gives Zilpah over here. So they're both using the surrogates at the same time. So she took her maid Zilpah here as Shippah. She's never described as Alma here. And as my note says about both of them, we hear nothing about her feelings about this transaction. But she gives her as an Isha, just as Rachel did Bilhah. And then Leah's Shippah here, despite that, she's still referred to by the narrator as a Shippah, bore Jacob a son. And that's what we're seeing here. So now we've seen that the surrogates, our children, are described as bearing Jacob a son, but not the first ones. And that's going to be important for the level that we read this as both the nation of Israel, but also in the post-exilic sense, that Judah, who's the key son for whom David, where David has his reign begin as king, who's not described as bore Jacob a son. Not that he's not a son of Jacob, plainly he is, but the narrator doesn't name him as one of those in this sequence of 6. So then we see it happens here with no further ado, and then Leah names this child Good Fortune, Bagad, meaning luck, or curiously the spice coriander. As Crane notes, his name bespeaks more than randomness, but a theology of cosmic purposelessness. Things could have been otherwise, and Leah knows this. And then we see the second one just as quickly, cranking them out here. And notice, as I was highlighting last time, no other events are described in all these years of bearing children. It won't be till verse 14 and the scene that follows that we'll look at next time that we see any kind of action other than the giving of women to have children. And Jacob throughout, as one commentator calls him, stud services. I've referred to him elsewhere as a sperm donor, but either way, he has no role in this. He's simply serving, as he's serving Laban, he's serving the women here to provide children. And so for the fourth one that comes out, or the second one from Leah's surrogate, the fourth of the surrogate here, Leah speaks for Zilpah. And notice that neither of the Shippah have agency in naming the children. They're named here. And as many feminist scholars have said recently, even other feminist scholars have often ignored them. They're in the text, but they're ignored by the characters, and they're even often ignored by commentators. But as the cover picture on this video has, they were not ignored by artists, especially the wonderful photographer Lauer, whose work I've got permission to use on many of these women in Genesis. So Leah says, happy am I, and it's interesting that she can describe herself as happy at this point. For the women will call me happy. And for the first time, she's concerned with what other people will think. It's literally daughters here, and as Jinsan notes, it refers especially to young women of childbearing age who will more greatly esteem her, thus reflecting her own desires. Unquote. Leah no longer refers her childbearing to seeking Jacob's attention nor her sibling rival, but rather to her reputation in the wider community. And notice how that plays out against the question of Sarah's reputation as an old woman who would either be laughed with or laughed at when they would see her nursing a child, again concerned at one level with what other women would see. And as the further note down below from Crane has, the only women Leah seems to care about are those anonymous ones. The ladies closest to her, Rachel, Zilpah, Bilhah, and eventually Dinah, her daughter, never rise to her consciousness. So she's happy, and she'll be called happy because of these children. She's now, for the first time, seeming to have happiness in herself, even though it's over a surrogate child. So now we've seen first 4 and now another 4, and what will happen to produce the other 4, we're going to see the first of 2 stories in this Jacob cycle where seemingly magic objects are involved in procreation. First mandrakes and then sticks with the sheep and goats. First with the mandrakes next time. See you for that. Bye-bye.